Introduce someone who really does need no introduction, because all of you will have read something that has been written by Michael on particularly the 15th century, but you do spread over other periods as well from time to time. I like the allusion in the title to two key articles which I remember in my youth, even before Michael started writing. The famous short controversy between Michael Poston and Bruce McFarlane over the costs of the 100 Years' War. I don't know how much that has been in Michael's mind when he's been thinking of the subject he's going to talk to us about, but we shall see with interest. Michael.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, he's stolen my thunder, hasn't he? Yes, I was thinking of the initially of the McFarlane-Poston debate. I mean, 50 years, well, it's more than 50 years since McFarlane first argued that there is a case, it seems to me a strong case, for thinking that while England was beaten, the English were enriched. And what McFarlane meant there was that the 100 Years' War was a war waged on French soil, by definition, therefore, at the French expense, and the English managed to gather more ransoms, plunder, and what Tony Budbury called other baubles of war than did the French. It's a short controversy in some ways because, as I think Michael hinted, McFarlane lost it quite quickly. Didn't stop him carrying on. Michael Poston responded, I mean, the essence of Michael Poston's response was that the costs of war, in terms of the taxation of the English people and the economic disruption, surely exceeded any winnings. There was no calculation based upon adding up all the ransoms and things that could result in the English being in credit. And I'm sure he was right on that. So there was a broad conceptual argument here, but there were also a lot of anecdotal evidence and swapping of examples. Surprising how both McFarlane and Poston managed to use some of the same examples to illustrate their case, and how frequently John Leyland managed to wade into the discussion. And subsequently there were a number of other contributions in what can be regarded as quite a slow-moving debate. Tony Pollard wrote about the great Earl of Shrewsbury in the 15th century, his Prophets of War. Michael Stansfield looked at the question of whether John Holland, Earl of Huntingdon and Duke of Exeter ended up in credit or not. I wrote about Robert Lord Mullins and Michael Jones, who I don't think is in here, is he? I think I deterred him. Michael Jones wrote about the Orleans ransom. All these supposedly worked out fully, but all somewhat ambiguous. And I say it's rather slow-moving. I think Michael Jones was the last major contributor around about 1990, until Remy Ambul's latest book, which made the whole thing look rather pointless, because he injected so many well-documented examples and demonstrated how many more ransoms and things took place on both sides, and how some people managed to be ransomed 7 or 10 times, that any attempt at profit and loss, I think, becomes impractical. Yes. So what does this paper do? Well, I'm not contributing to the warfare or the accountancy, but I'm looking at other types of costs, because I think costs and loss are not merely material. Indeed, with reference to the last paper, I would suggest that perhaps the profits of war, the royal favour, etc., is not always to be seen in monetary terms, and kings have other ways of rewarding, and the benefits of good service can come in other forms. But as far as costs go, well, in a strange way, although wars are about killing people, we don't seem to have paid very much attention to the mortality among the English peerage. We haven't looked at the life expectancy of the peerage, and we haven't looked at the succession of the English peerage. And I suggest that perhaps the costs of war in those terms deserve more attention, deserve more weight than they've received so far. The paper is based on quite a lot of secondary work on the English peerage, complete peerage in Macfarlane and various other places, and on the warfare. One might mention the works of such historians as Christopher Almond and Anne Curry, supplemented on the one side by the soldier database, but on the other by the calendar of inquisitions post-mortem. I'm very involved in the calendar of inquisitions post-mortem. So from my point of view, this is a calendar of inquisitions post-mortem study, plus the genealogies, the contemporary genealogies, of which there are a great deal. It is a work in progress in the sense that the genealogies, I've got them, but I haven't really searched them and used them fully yet. Okay, well, a few broad parameters. If you look at the peers, the members of the House of Lords of Henry V in 1413 to 15, I think one can demonstrate quite easily that all of them, or their heirs, except for three, seem to have served in France at some point. And perhaps the others served in Scotland, the Earl of Westmoreland, for example. Similarly, if you go to the other end and look at the members of the peerage in the early 1440s, you find that all of them had served in France or were to serve in France. I can actually add that 1440s is an important type for the creation of new peers by Henry VI, and those are either people who've provided good military service already, or they go on to do it and get involved in things like the Battle of Castillon. A long time ago, Michael Poecker argued or demonstrated that there was a big turnout of the peerage in 1415, but that it diminished as the 15th century phase of the 100 Years' War went on. And this was what Jack Lander used in an article now 40 years old to demonstrate a big turnout in 1475. Both campaigns clearly starting the war involving the king. Of course, 1475 ended in 1475, so he couldn't pursue it further. There actually, I was always struck by the fact that there are actually quite good reasons for this, because actually the peerage are not merely a military caste. They are great landholders, they're involved in governing England and so on. They've got other things to do rather than traipsing across France and beating up the French. But there's another reason why they're not there, which is perhaps neglected, which is that they were dead or they were under age. And, the peerage, the active peerage does diminish during the course of the 15th century phase of the 100 Years' War, and at least partly because of it. Well, we seem to be having a sort of phase of let's bash Macfarlane today. The third bash of Macfarlane is to look a bit at his statistics about the demography of the English peerage, because Macfarlane did do the work to look at succession and produced a set of statistics. And I quote, "Failure in the direct line happened on the average to some quarter of the peerage, every 25 years during the 14th and 15th centuries." He was focused at this point on the Wars of the Roses, and he said the Wars of the Roses did not exceed the average. There were no more peers being killed off or their lines failing Wars of the Roses than there were on the periods either side. I will come back to this, but Macfarlane's statistics are a little bit odd in some ways, because if a father succeeds a son, that's an unbroken line. If, however, a brother succeeds a brother, that's a broken line. And, I'm not sure contemporaries would have regarded it like that. And, of course, if the line ends in daughters or sisters, that's a broken line. The statistics are not that impressive, actually, when you think about it, because 1400 to 1450, first half of the 15th century, does include rebellions against the Lancastrians. We can make quite a list of people who come to a rather sticky end there. Lord Lumley, the Earls of Salisbury, Kent, Huntingdon, the Earl of Northumberland, the Earl of Worcester. They've got quite a few violent deaths there. If we go back the extra quarter of a century, we find the people who were appealed by the appellants and the appellants themselves. Actually there's really quite a high quotient of peers who have violent deaths, whichever 25 years you choose to mention, and therefore perhaps Bridbury was right. I didn't ever think Bridbury was right, but perhaps Bridbury was right, that every generation was engaged in some sort of war and witnessed violent deaths. There were a few peerages that were extinguished. We've heard about Thomas Duke of Clarence at Beaujeu, Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Worcester at Meux, the Burnell barony. Lord Burnell was not killed in battle, but his only son did die violently. Lord Darcy died on campaign, and that was the end of the Darcys. We've heard again and again about the son of Lord Fanhope, Sir John Cornwall, who was killed at Meux, as we heard, before the eyes of his father and to the great irritation of Henry V. Of course, he's a more important person than he looks, because his mother is Henry IV's sister, and I suspect, had he survived, his future career would have resulted in him becoming rather more than Lord Fanhope. And Lord Poynings. A few peerages stop there: Clarence, Worcester, Burnell, Darcy, Fanhope, Poynings, though in the last four cases the property, of course, is inherited by other people. The whole family is extinguished. It's just the direct line. Well, people get killed. As Neville Shute said, and I love quoting Neville Shute, violent death, people do get killed. It does happen occasionally, even in the best conducted wars. And I've included people who die on foreign service, e.g. from dysentery, as well as those who are killed by enemy action. I mean, if you die in some obscure French place, we don't necessarily know exactly what killed you. And it's clear that it's easier to chart peers than the heirs of peers. The complete peerage won't normally tell you about that, let alone sons and brothers. But the genealogies will tell you that, and that's why I've got to do more work on we'll usually tell you that. Well, what about mortality? Well, we can make a reasonable list to start with. Harfleur, you have two earls, the Earl of Arundel, the Earl of Suffolk. Agincourt, we've heard of the Duke of York. Thought it was an act of great restraint by Gary not to tell us that he was a fat man, fell off his horse and suffocated in his armour. Another Earl of Suffolk, Lord Fitzwalter, and actually the son of Lord Bardolph. Beaujeu, Duke of Clarence and Lord Ross. Mokes, the Earl of Worcester, Lord Clifford. Orléans and Patay, Earl of Salisbury, Lord Poynings. Gerberoy, the Earl of Arundel, and of course much later on the Chatillon, the Earl of Shrewsbury and Viscount Lisle. And there are plenty of others interspersed in smaller engagements in between. The concentration is early on. Let's take a case, because in fact I've almost used my time. Let's take a case rather than running through them all. The de la Pole earldom of Suffolk. Michael de la Pole, of course, the first, is the one who's impeached under Richard II. And it's his son who died at Harfleur. His Inquisition post-mortem records his death in September. And then, of course, his son and heir, Michael de la Pole III, was killed at Agincourt. And with the death of Michael de la Pole III, the next heir was his brother William, who succeeded as fourth de la Pole Earl of Suffolk, and of course has a lengthy, glorious career involving Patay becoming Marquis of Suffolk, Duke of Suffolk, and being impeached in 1450 and finally deprived of his head on that sandbank, the Goodwin Sands. Now, Michael de la Pole's death, that's the third Michael de la Pole, and the succession of his brother William counts as a failure in the direct line in Macfarlane's statistics, which I think is a statistical oddity in Macfarlane's methods. Michael III died without male issue, but he was only 23 at his death, and he left 3 daughters behind him, aged 5, 4 and 0, who were unable to succeed because the earldom was entailed in the male line. They did get some of the de la Pole lands, and some of that was quite valuable. And 2 of those daughters died young, and Catherine, the eldest, was the only one who was left, and she was persuaded to become a nun of Broussard. I wonder whether she was persuaded by her guardian, her uncle William, and duly became Abbess of Broussard. So he scooped the pool, William scooped the pool and got all the lands. Sorry, Michael was 21, not 23. But here we have the failure of the Michael de la Pole III line. He's been killed, his line ends, but he's only 21. And he has a wife of about the same age. And clearly the working parts, the fertility is working perfectly well with them. So he had plenty of time to procreate more sons had he not suffered death at the Battle of Agincourt. So it's not just the war is a significant element there. What else? Well, what else does the war produce? Well, it produces rapid succession. It results in you running through a series of heirs and them succeeding younger. It means that you have long minorities because those who are killed are predominantly young men, therefore any offspring they have are very young when they die, and there's a long period of time before the next one is of age. And it's also a feature, the encumbrance by dowagers. A long time ago, Charles Ross and Bryn Mawr Pugh of this university wrote about the income tax of 1436 and argued that the statistic that H.L. Gray had ignored the number of dowagers who were contained there. And one of the key examples that they emphasised was the Ross peerage. The Ross family succeeded in, suffered considerably from the 100 Years' War. John Lord Ross, who was killed in 1421, died aged 23, and his widow lived on till 1478. His brother Thomas then succeeded. There's another of these Macfarlane breaks, and died in the war in 1430, and his widow lived on till 1467. And his son Thomas, aged 3, was a hostage from not 1430 on, but from 1450 on. He did indeed marry. But his widow lived on till 1487. And what Ross and Pugh pointed out was that here we have this impoverished peerage in 1436, which is only taxed on a wealth of £173. But that's because of all these dowagers. There's actually a fourth dowager, from a widow of an earlier peer who had not had a chance to die in the 100 Years' War. And the actual value of the peerage was £1,100. So the peerage is unable to pull its political or other weight for a very long period of time. The wealth is dispersed, and obviously Thomas Lord Ross II, from 1430 to 1450, is spending most of the time in an extremely long minority. And of course, war can affect your capacity to reproduce anyway. John Beaufort, the Earl of Somerset, captured in 1421, Duke of Somerset later, is a prisoner of war from 1421 to 38. And indeed it was assumed that he would have no children, and therefore his brother Edmund was advanced to Earl of Dorset. He did eventually marry. He married in 1442, and he left a daughter, Lady Margaret Beaufort, aged 1. So a long period of no marriage, no capacity to reproduce, and then a long minority. As Michael Stansfield showed, John Holland, the Earl of Huntingdon and Duke of Exeter, in his case, the balance between costs and profits of war seems to have been definitely on the cost side, and he got over it by marrying a series of dowagers, which meant he had only one son, and indeed he sold off the marriage of that son. As Stansfield says, the effects of his capture and ransom went far beyond the mere financial costs. And thanks to Remy, looking at the hostages of 1450 in return for the release of Edmund Beaufort, the Commander-in-Chief in Normandy, we now know, I think we knew that these people were hostages, but we didn't realise that they remained hostages for such a long period of time. George Neville, the heir to the Abergavenny peerage, was a hostage from 1450 to 66, during which period he couldn't marry. 66 he returned to England, and he did marry, and he did produce offspring, and indeed there's still a Marquis of Abergavenny today, his descendant. Thomas Dacre is the heir to the Dacre barony, is a hostage from 1450. I don't know quite whether he died in captivity, but he had died by 1458, when it's his brother Randall who succeeded to the peerage. And of course Thomas Ross, whom I've mentioned before, also had a lengthy period in peerage. Producing heirs and spares, well, I seem to be a bit short of spares. So we have a phenomenon here that is quite common. Late marriage. Long periods, I postulate long periods of separation between husband and wife. Of course, we can very seldom chart the itinerary of the wife. We're not usually as fortunate as with Richard, Duke of York, and the Duchess Cecily, who, if you like, as Commander-in-Chief, is a public pairing. And clearly, if they're apart, they're not going to produce an awful lot of children during that era. Of course, I have to say, this doesn't mean an absence of sex. We don't have to speculate that our unfortunate soldiers in France had to do without that. And they do manage to produce a remarkable number of bastards between them, who are recorded. Of course, it's mainly male bastards that are recorded, but one can quickly run through a list of the bastard of Bedford, the bastard of Clarence, the bastards of Exeter, the bastards of Fauconberg, bastards of Gloucester, the bastards of Salisbury, the bastards of Somerset, the bastards of Suffolk, most of whom, I think, were born in France to English invaders and French women. But of course they can't inherit. Okay, so I think the wars do result in inevitably in mortality, and this mortality matters to more than simply the individuals. It does result in a reduction in the numbers of heirs. It does result in some diversion or even termination of inheritances, and it does result in quite long periods when peers, etc., can't breed. Does it have any more significant implications? Well, in the short term, certainly I would say it did. I mean, the 1415 campaign is certainly a most impressive display, with all four English dukes go on campaign. We have 7 earls, not the Earl of Devon, who is probably blind, but we have the heir of the Earl of Devon, and we have 2 young men who are heirs to earldoms, which had been involved in the rebellions of 1400 to 1408, and who next year are allowed to enter their inheritances. That's Norfolk and Northumberland. So that's quite a display. It's 8 out of 10, or 10 out of 10, since both those boys went there. That is all the higher ranks of the nobility that there actually are, of which obviously York is killed, and his heir doesn't inherit, isn't able to have livery till the 1430s. The Earl of Arundel is killed. The Earl of Somerset doesn't actually die on that campaign, but he dies shortly afterwards. and with the result that his next oldest underage brother succeeds. So we have premature mortality of young men, which meant numerous and long minorities. Now, it's not just the war that explains why these other dukes disappear. They didn't breed, they didn't produce children by their wives, and so on and so forth. But there were, as the wars progressed, less dukes, earls and barons of age who were able to participate in the war. And Henry VI's mass creations of the 1440s brought the numbers up to scratch, rather than actually resulting in a substantially larger peerage than there had been. Two results from that. One, I think I hinted at with regard to Michael Poecker, which is actually there were less earls and barons available to serve militarily in the 1430s and 40s, partly because of mortality, but certainly because of many of the peerages were represented by people who were underage. And very strikingly, there are much less peers available to serve in Parliament. Not as in 1415, 12 or 14 senior peers. There are half a dozen, some of the parliaments for the late 1430s and 1440s. It's a cyclical process, I think. I don't think that one is necessarily, indeed, I don't think one is saying at all that we have a fundamental and permanent change in the peerage. The lands and property of these people who died are recycled through, in many cases, their female relatives. But it does mean that from the point of view of leadership, both in war and at home, there is a substantial reduction in the number of peers available to provide it. Thank you very much.